Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to talk to you about the resin infusion process. So let's have a look at the equipment that I use for resin infusion. The vacuum pump, the catch pot, the pressure gauge, the scales and the clamps. Once you have all of your reinforcement material in your mould, the first thing you then need to do is to set up a vacuum, and this is the pump that I use. This is a Javac CC141 pump. It's a double stage pump and it has an ultimate vacuum of 15 microns or 0.02 millibars, which is exactly what I need because I always look for at least 25 millibars for my vacuum. It has a displacement of 5.3 cubic feet per minute, which means it's great for the larger jobs. It can draw down very quickly. It is a very expensive piece of equipment, and as you can see on this one, it has an isolator valve. The whole idea of this is that once you've finished your infusion, you isolate the pump before you turn it off. Otherwise there's a danger that oil from the pump can be drawn back into the product. This is our catch pot. As I just mentioned, the pump is a very expensive piece of equipment and it needs to be looked after. The last thing that you want when you're doing your infusion is to draw any excess resin through and then into the pump, because once in the pump would then be completely ruined. So between the mould and the pump, you put one of these pieces of equipment. This is a catch pot and it does exactly as the name suggests. Any excess resin drawn through the vacuum infusion line is then caught in the catch pot in the paper cup. Once the job is completely cured, the paper cup is then removed and thrown away. The reason we might get excess resin is because once we've weighed our reinforcement, we then calculate exactly how much resin we need, and we usually put about a third extra just to make sure we don't have a resin poor product. As I mentioned before, when I do my resin infusion, I want at least 25 millibars in the vacuum. The only way you're going to check that, because the pressure gauge on the catch pot isn't very accurate, is to use one of these pieces of equipment here. This is a Digitron 2025P. This is an absolute pressure gauge. What you do with this is once you have your vacuum drawn down, you then insert the hose from this into the resin infusion line. You clamp off the vacuum hose towards the pump, and every minute you check on the gauge to see if you have a pressure drop. You do what they call a 5-minute drop test. As I said, checking every minute, and we are making sure that we have at least 25 millibars. You want to try and get it as low as possible, but 25 is the absolute minimum. Set of scales isn't something you might think of with resin infusion, but they are a very important piece of equipment. You need to know exactly how much your product is going to weigh with the reinforcement and if you're using it core material, so you can work out exactly how much resin you need. If you're using carbon fibre, aramid, woven or twill e-glass, then it has to be a 1-to-1. If you're using chop strand mat, for example, you would then use 2.5 times the weight of resin to the weight of material. So if you've got 1 kilo chop strand mat, you would then use 2.5 kilos of resin. If you don't, you end up with either a resin rich or a resin poor product, and then the quality isn't as good. A small but very important piece of equipment. This is just a clamp. Although I say just a clamp, without this clamp you wouldn't be able to get your vacuum started. You put this on the infusion line so that you can draw the bag down. If you don't, you have an open bag and you'd never be able to get a vacuum. Once you have the vacuum, as I said before, you insert your hose from your pressure gauge, and then you use this clamp onto the vacuum line, the one that goes towards the pump. The idea then being you can get your 5-minute drop test done. Once you've then finished your drop test, you then reclamp the resin infusion line, place the resin line into your resin reservoir, and then release the clamp to allow the resin to flow. So I've talked to you about the equipment that I use for resin infusion. Now I'm going to talk to you about the consumables. Things like the paper cups, the peel ply, the vacuum bag, the infusion hoses, the vacuum hoses. This is the paper cup that goes inside our catch pot. I mentioned earlier on about the catch pot. Any excess resin is drawn through the vacuum line into the catch pot, into this paper cup, and then once the job is finished and the resin has cured, the paper cup is then thrown out. Not a very exciting piece of equipment, but one that's very important nonetheless. As I said before, this is to protect our pump because we really don't want to ruin an expensive piece of equipment. This is our vacuum infusion hose. This is an MTI hose. You talk about that a little bit more in a second. There are a couple of ways of setting up a vacuum with the mould. One of the ways you can do it is to actually use a twisted nylon rope around the outside. This will then create a channel which will cause the vacuum, or you can use this hose, which is the one that I use. This, as I said, is an MTI hose. It's a membrane infusion hose. As you can see, it's a spiral wrap which is normally used for the resin infusion line. Here it's used to create our vacuum. You can see the whites around, that is actually the membrane. The idea of this membrane is it allows air to permeate through, but it doesn't allow any resin. In theory, you could get rid of the catch pot, but I like to have it just to be on the safe side. This hose is called Blade Runner. It sounds something really exciting, but actually it's just a resin infusion hose. Normally you would use a normal hose that goes through into the spiral wrap, which I mentioned earlier on with the MTI hose. This is the one that I use though, slightly different. It's quite a large bore hose. It's actually 15mm. It's a corrugated hose, as you can see, and it's then surrounded in this cloth. The cloth has a flat flange at the bottom, the idea being that once the vacuum is applied, this flange then distributes the weight of the hose and it stops leaving any marks. It's quite a new product that's only just been brought into the UK, a little bit like the membrane hose I showed you just now. It's come from Germany, not really used very much in the UK, so we'll see how it goes. To transfer the resin from the resin line to the spiral wrap, you would normally use a connector. This is the one that I use. This is the connector for Blade Runner. As you can see, it is quite a large piece of equipment. What it does is it sits on top of the peel ply under the vacuum bag. Once the vacuum is applied, you then pierce a small hole in the bag and you then attach this elbow. There is a grommet that fits under the elbow to make sure that you have a good vacuum. So what you're looking at here is peel ply. This goes over the top of the reinforcement and under the vacuum bag before you apply your resin. The idea of this piece of material, this is either nylon or polyester depending on which type you buy. The idea is that once this is removed after the curing process has taken place, this actually leaves a textured finish, which is ideal for applying a top coat or if you need to infuse anything to the product. This is the vacuum bag. This is obviously the most important piece of equipment of all the consumables used in resin infusion, because without the vacuum bag you wouldn't be able to vacuum your product down. It's made of nylon. It has good elongation properties, which mean that once attached to the mould and the vacuum is applied, it will stretch. You don't want to stretch it too much because then you could cause all sorts of problems like voids. So you would pleat this piece of material every time there's a change of direction, say on a corner, and then once the vacuum is applied, it will then suck down. If you don't do that and you get the voids, you could end up with resin rich areas which would spoil the product. It's very good at autoclave and it can be used to 160 degrees. I don't do autoclave though. So I've talked to you a little bit about the equipment that's used in resin infusion, and I do hope you've enjoyed this little video. I've talked to you today about the pump, the catch pot, the scales, the clamp and the gauge that I use when I'm doing my resin infusion. I've also talked to you about the consumables that I use, that being the MTI hose, the really exciting sounding resin infusion hose Blade Runner. Talked about the paper cup, the peel pie, the vacuum bag and the connector that's used to connect our resin line to Blade Runner. Now unfortunately, being consumables, most of the equipment that is used in the consumables is disposed of once the project has finished. Once the resin has cured, the peel ply, the vacuum bag and the hoses are then discarded. The nice thing about the MTI hose that I use is that once the resin has cured around the outside of the membrane, the inner core, the spiral wrap, can actually be removed and it can then be reused. And we actually use it for smaller jobs that we do. We actually use it as our resin infusion line. So connecting a small bore hose through a connector and then putting the spiral wrap into our product. we can then reuse this. So at least we can actually use something again. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the little video, and hopefully you will come back and see us again soon.